Welcome, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be checking out Chapter 15 from Scott Howard Swain's book, A Practical EmPath, Rewire Your Mind. And this chapter is all about politics. So how to gracefully deal with those differing political ideas and actions that honestly sometimes make us want to scream into a pillow.
Yeah, and you know what's so interesting about Swain's approach is that he doesn't shy away from the intensity of those feelings. He actually starts by acknowledging just how difficult it can be to empathize with people you know who hold different political views.
He even calls it a threat response. He brings up this whole idea of the lizard brain.
Right.
Can you maybe unpack that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. So imagine you're at a family gathering and someone brings up some hot button political issue, maybe something about taxes or healthcare or something like that. And suddenly you feel that familiar surge of anger or maybe fear. Swain argues that this is your lizard brain, that primal part of your brain that's just focused on survival kicking into gear.
So it's like our lizard brain is going, wait, hold on. Their ideas threaten my way of life.
Exactly. And Swain uses this really, really brilliant analogy of opposing political teams. He emphasizes that each team often see the other's policies as a direct attack on their values and their well-being. It's almost like this primal fear of losing something that's essential to who we are.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But if we're all kind of running on this lizard brain fuel, how can we ever have a productive conversation, let alone find any kind of common ground?
Well, that's where Swain's practical empathy practice, or PEP, comes in. It's basically a framework for moving beyond that knee-jerk reaction and engaging in, more thoughtful and compassionate dialogue, even when you disagree really strongly with someone's perspective.
Right, I'm intrigued. So how do we actually apply PEP in the real world? Let's say I'm talking to someone who holds completely different political views than I do. Where do I even begin?
Well, Swain emphasizes that the first step is to shift our focus from evaluating to empathizing. It's about trying to understand the other person's individual values rather than just making assumptions based on their political label.
So instead of instantly labeling someone as conservative or liberal and assuming I know everything about their beliefs, I should try to understand what's actually motivating their opinions.
Exactly. And Swain breaks down the three main political groups: conservative, progressive/liberal, and libertarian, and kind of their associated values. But he's really clear that these are generalizations, not rigid boxes to put people in.
Right. Because we all hold a mix of values to some degree.
Yes.
Someone could be fiscally conservative but socially liberal, for example.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that each person's values are shaped by a complex web of experiences and beliefs. And instead of just assuming we know what those are based on a political label, PEP encourages us to approach the conversation with genuine curiosity.
This is reminding me of a conversation I had recently with a friend who holds very different political views than I do. We were talking about education, and I totally went into evaluation mode. I kept thinking, well, they obviously don't care about X because they believe Y.
Yeah. It's so easy to fall into that trap. And what's interesting is that often our own political values, even if we don't realize it, influence how we interpret and judge other people's actions. So it's we're bringing our own biases to the table before the conversation even begins.
Okay, so self-awareness is key here. But how do we actually move beyond those knee-jerk judgments and start practicing genuine empathy? What are the concrete steps involved in PEP?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what we'll be diving into next. Swain provides a really practical, step-by-step framework for applying PEP in those tricky conversations.
Okay, I'm ready for those steps. But before we get there, it feels like there's kind of a bigger question looming here. Why should we even bother with this whole PEP thing in the first place? What's the payoff?
Yeah, that's a million-dollar question, isn't it? Why bother putting in the effort to empathize with people who seem so fundamentally different from us, especially politically?
Right. It almost feels counterintuitive. Shouldn't we be standing up for our own beliefs and kind of challenging those who disagree with us?
Well, Swain actually addresses that head on. He argues that true empathy isn't about abandoning our own convictions or agreeing with everything we hear. It's more about creating a space for genuine understanding, even maybe especially when we disagree.
Okay, I'm starting to see the distinction there, but how does it actually play out in a conversation? What does PEP actually look like in action?
Well, remember those three components we mentioned earlier: observation without evaluation, recognizing feelings, and identifying values and needs. Each of those plays a crucial role in shifting the dynamic from confrontation to connection.
Right. I remember those terms, but I'm a little fuzzy on how they actually work together. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine you're talking to someone who passionately supports a political candidate that you strongly oppose. Instead of immediately launching into a debate about their policies or, character flaws or whatever, a PEP approach might sound something like this. It seems like you really connect with this candidate's message. Can you tell me more about what resonates with you?
Wow. That's so different from how I usually approach those conversations. I'm usually ready to jump in with all the reasons why I think they're wrong.
Right. It's a subtle shift, but it's a powerful one. By simply asking someone to share their perspective without judgment, you're signaling that you respect their opinion even if you don't share it.
Okay, I'm seeing how that kind of lays the groundwork for a more productive conversation. But what about those times when things start to get a little heated? Like when the lizard brain starts to take over and you feel that urge to fight back?
Yeah, well, Swain emphasizes the importance of self-awareness in those moments. He encourages us to identify our own triggers, those topics or phrases that instantly set us off.
That makes a lot of sense. If we know what pushes our buttons, we can be more prepared to manage our reactions when those buttons get pushed.
Exactly. It's like knowing your own personal warning signs. Once you're aware of those triggers, you can start to develop strategies for staying calm and grounded, in the midst of a challenging conversation.
So it's about catching ourselves before we react impulsively.
Exactly. And one of the simplest but most effective strategies Swain recommends is the power of the pause.
The pause. Like just stopping and taking a breath.
Yeah, exactly. When you feel those emotions rising, take a deep breath, step back from the conversation for a moment, and remind yourself of your intention. Are you trying to win an argument, or are you trying to foster understanding?
Okay, that sounds simple enough, but let's be real. Sometimes it's hard to resist that urge to kind of fight fire with fire, especially when someone is being particularly aggressive or dismissive.
Swain acknowledges that challenge. He emphasizes that we can't control other people's behavior. We can only control our own responses. He encourages us to remember that engaging in an unproductive argument often just escalates the conflict and reinforces those negative patterns of communication.
So sometimes the most empathetic thing we can do is to simply disengage from the conversation.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that not every conversation is going to be productive or lead to a change of heart. And sometimes choosing to step away or redirect the conversation is the most compassionate and skillful approach.
I'm starting to see how PEP is almost like a martial art for political conversations. It's about learning to deflect those verbal attacks and respond with grace and intention.
That's a great analogy. It's about staying centered and grounded even when the other person is trying to throw you off balance.
This is all so insightful. I'm already feeling more equipped to handle those tricky political conversations. But tell me, are there any specific phrases or questions Swain recommends using when we're trying to practice PEP?
Absolutely. He provides a whole toolbox of language tips for fostering empathy and understanding. For example, he encourages us to use phrases like, help me understand, or tell me more about why that's important to you.
So it's about asking those open-ended questions that invite the other person to share their perspective without feeling like they're being interrogated or judged.
Precisely. It's not about leading them to your conclusion or anything. It's about creating a safe space for them to open up and share their perspective authentically.
Okay, let's say we've mastered the art of the pause, and we're armed with this toolbox of empathy-boosting phrases. What's the next step in this PEP journey?
Well, Swain encourages us to kind of reflect on our own values. What's truly important to us? Why do we hold the beliefs we do?
It's like taking inventory of our own internal compass, making sure it's calibrated correctly before we start navigating someone else's terrain.
That's a great way to put it. And once we have a clear understanding of our own values, we can communicate them more effectively and respectfully.
This is all starting to click, but let's be honest, some people are just plain difficult to talk to, especially when it comes to politics. Any tips for dealing with those folks who seem determined to argue?
Swain reminds us that we can't control other people's behavior. We can only control our own responses.
So even if the other person is being a total jerk, we can still choose to respond with empathy and grace.
Exactly. It's about setting boundaries and refusing to engage in those unproductive arguments. You can always choose to disengage or redirect the conversation.
It's like saying, I'm not playing this game. I'm here for a meaningful conversation, not a shouting match.
Exactly. And sometimes walking away is the most compassionate and courageous thing you can do.
This is also empowering. PEP is like this secret weapon for navigating those challenging conversations, whether they're about politics or anything else that triggers strong emotions.
It's true. And Swain reminds us that PEP is a practice. It's not something we master overnight. It takes time, patience, and a willingness to make mistakes.
That's reassuring. It's like learning a new language. We're not going to be fluent right away, but with practice, we can become more proficient over time.
Exactly. And the more we practice PEP, the more natural and effortless it will become.
Okay, so PEP is a practice, a journey, not a destination. But does Swain give any indication of what that destination might look like? What's the ultimate goal of practicing PEP?
That's a great question to ponder, and it leads us directly into the heart of Swain's message. It's about something much bigger than just mastering a communication technique. It's about the transformative power of empathy to create a more just and compassionate world. We've been really unpacking Scott Howard Swain's approach to political conversations from his book, A Practical EmPath, Rewire Your Mind, and it feels like we're moving from, just how to talk to something much bigger here. Yeah, and that's exactly where Swain wants to take us. He argues that practicing PEP isn't just about smoothing over disagreements, it's really about laying the groundwork for a more just and compassionate world.
Okay, I'm all ears because that sounds like a pretty lofty goal, especially given how divided things feel right now. How does Swain connect those dots, from individual conversations to societal change?
Well, he makes this really compelling point that when we genuinely try to understand where someone is coming from, their values, their experiences, even their fears, it becomes a lot harder to demonize them.
It's like taking those enemy labels off. And remember, if we're all human beings, even when we vehemently disagree, on policies or candidates or whatever.
Right. And once we start seeing each other's humanity, it opens up a space for more nuanced conversations. So instead of just battling over who's right or wrong, we can start exploring those why questions. Why do we care about these issues so much? What kind of world are we each trying to build?
I'm thinking about some of the really divisive issues that we face today, like climate change or social justice. I mean, these aren't just abstract debates. They're about people's lives, their livelihoods, their futures. PEP seems like a way to kind of bring that human element back into the conversation.
And Swain believes that's precisely what's missing from so much of our political discourse today. We've become so focused on winning arguments and scoring points that we've lost sight of the fact that we're all in this together.
That's so true. It's like we've forgotten how to have those difficult conversations with respect and a genuine desire to understand.
And what Swain argues is that when we approach these conversations with empathy, it changes not only the tone of the dialogue, but also the outcomes. So instead of just digging our heels in and defending our position, we become open to hearing different perspectives, considering alternative solutions, and even maybe finding common ground.
It's like we're shifting from a battlefield mentality to a more collaborative one. Instead of seeing the other side as the enemy, we start to see them as potential allies in creating a better world.
And Swain believes that this shift in perspective is essential for addressing the complex challenges that we face as a society. Climate change, poverty, inequality. These issues require us to work together, not against each other.
This is really resonating with me. Swain's approach feels both hopeful and practical at the same time. He's not suggesting that we all have to agree or, become best friends with our political opponents. He's just reminding us to treat each other with basic human decency even, or maybe especially when we disagree.
And what's so powerful about PEP is that it's not just a set of techniques or phrases. It's really more of a mindset, a way of being in the world. It's about choosing empathy over judgment, understanding over accusation, and connection over division.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I'm walking away not only with some practical tips for handling those tricky political conversations, but also a renewed sense of hope that we can actually create a more just and compassionate world, one conversation at a time.
And isn't that a conversation worth having?
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to check out Scott Howard Swain's book, A Practical EmPath, Rewire Your Mind. And we hope this deep dive has kind of inspired you to embrace the power of PEP in your own lives.
Remember, even small acts of empathy can have a ripple effect, creating a more understanding and compassionate world.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep practicing empathy, and keep those conversations going.